Hey there, Laker Gang. Mr. Nunley back again, about to drop some knowledge on your head, as usual. So, this will likely be our last video for NTI Social Studies. Today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the causes of the Civil War and the time after the Civil War called the Reconstruction. These are really important pieces of our history that I want to make sure that I explain to you all. So, I'm going to cut back on the memes a tad bit, and even if it is a simplified version, I hope it helps, and of course, I hope it helps you answer your worksheet today. You see, the Civil War had tons of different causes, but our main two were slavery and states' rights. You see, like we talked about before, the North and South were totally different. The North didn't really have a need for slaves anymore because of advancements in machines, and they had large factories and free labor. The South, however, was different. They relied on farming, especially cotton, for their economy or jobs. The South made 75% of the world's cotton at the time, and to make sure that they had enough, they relied on the hard work and trade of African slaves. Without that, the big farms in the South would fail, and people in the South would lose everything. So, to make things simple, slaves weren't common in the North, but the South relied on them. As we started expanding westward and manifesting our destiny, Southern pioneers wanted to bring slavery into the new states, but Northerners didn't want this to be allowed. And this turned into a big issue. People in the South thought that states' rights were at risk. If the government was going to tell them what they couldn't do about this, they thought they would tell them what they could and couldn't do about other things. And they thought that each state should be able to choose if they would have slavery or not. And we saw this in Kansas, where people were literally fighting and killing each other over the vote for slavery to happen. So up came the presidential election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln was running for president, and it was well known that he was anti-slavery. That was so unpopular in the South that most southern states didn't even put his name on the ballot. You literally couldn't vote for him in some southern states, but he still won. After this happened, many southern states decided they had enough and were so afraid that he would try to end slavery that they seceded. They left the United States and formed their own country, the Confederate States of America, under Jefferson Davis. President Lincoln wanted to keep the Union together, so he sent troops down to try and keep this from happening. But after Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter, the war had started and their message was clear. They were willing to fight and die for their rights, especially their right to own slaves. They did not want their way of life to change. The Civil War was the bloodiest war, resulting in more deaths of Americans than any other war in history. And that's because people on both sides were Americans, whether they were Union Blue or Confederate Gray. During the war, Abraham Lincoln passed the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all slaves in the southern states. And he did this to show that the Union was fighting not only to keep the nation together, but also fighting to free slaves in the South. And after 5 long years, the war was over, and a time called Reconstruction began. It was called Reconstruction for multiple reasons, but mostly because much of the South had been destroyed during the war, and its economy was in shambles, with slavery being outlawed. However, 5 days after the war, President Lincoln was assassinated and killed. Reconstruction took a much different turn. You would think that life for African Americans would be much better at this point, now that slavery was over. However, it would be a long time before this would really be the case. So let's talk about the good and the bad parts of Reconstruction. Here are the good parts. Slavery was officially illegal, and in 1865, the 13th Amendment was made to the Constitution, making sure it stayed that way. Former slaves now had many more rights that they'd never had before. They could work for themselves and their family, they could vote, and some were even elected to government positions. Congress created the Freedmen's Bureau to help create schools for African Americans so that they could get an education and learn the skills they needed to be successful. However, it wasn't easy. White Southerners weren't going to just magically start treating former slaves like citizens. The government actually had to send U.S. troops to the South to make sure that African Americans' rights were being protected. However, Reconstruction officially ended in 1877, and the troops left. Now things started to get much worse for African Americans. Even though they were free, many former slaves had no money and nowhere to go. So they became sharecroppers, which meant they ended up working for the people that owned them, and they made almost no money. So really, life didn't change much for them at all. A terrorist group known as the Ku Klux Klan was formed, and their members would dress in white robes. At night, they would go out and attack and oftentimes kill African Americans just because of the color of their skin. They also tried to scare them from voting, and this caused many racist politicians and laws to be passed. These were called the Jim Crow laws, and it caused something called segregation, which meant that even though African Americans were free, they had to live separately. They had to use separate businesses, go to separate schools, even drink out of separate water fountains. And these things that African Americans used were always much worse than white facilities. So even though African Americans were free, it would be a long time before they were ever treated equally. And racism is something that's still very alive today. So thanks for watching the video, Laker Gang. I really hope that this helped you all. I hope you stay safe, and I hope you have a great day. Keep it 212, everybody. And now, I've waited so long to say this. Get out!